Everybody for coming. It's a real treat to be here tonight. So we're going to get started, and the best way to tell you about my journey is to show you a video clip of when I was trying to promote the book right before it released a couple of years ago.
Welcome back to the program. Lou and Jackie here, and we love telling you about books that are available because especially when they're interesting topics too.
Absolutely. Let's focus on an Iowan we're very excited to have here in our living room, who is an author. That is Patti Stockdale. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And we were asking during the break, how long have you been an author or into writing?
Yeah, I went back to college when I was 35.
Okay.
And so it's been over 20 years when I started this book. And then I shelved it for a long time, and I did different kinds of writing.
Okay.
Pulled it out when I moved back to Iowa a couple of years ago, and here it is.
There you go. So you moved back to Iowa. We said Iowa writer. So tell everybody where you're living now.
Yep, I live in Ankeny, Iowa, and I grew up in Applington, Iowa.
All right. So true blue Iowan, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
I love this. You started this 20 years ago?
I did.
You said, was this part of going back to school, or was this an idea you've had long before then?
I went back to college and decided I liked creative writing, so I studied that, and I needed a project. And at the same time, my mom and her sisters found a tin of letters their parents had exchanged while they courted during World War I.
Really?
Yeah, so they gave me permission to use that as the inspiration for my story.
Well, that's like perfect timing.
I know. Yeah.
Where'd you go to school at?
I went to school at Vermont College.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then so the writing came about, and you have this base to draw from, and
did.
and so that was the inspiration for what you've created.
And that almost seems like they're feeding you the perfect story, but you shelved it.
I did.
Okay, so talk about that.
So it was a distance learning program, so I would have to be on campus 1 week a semester, and then I could do the rest of the work. So I worked full time while I was going to school, and then my husband works for the Department of Agriculture, and we kept moving around the country.
Yeah.
And we moved to Wisconsin, and there was a job opportunity at a nonprofit senior center as a programs director, and I thought, that sounds great, and I could use the money at that point. So I took that job, and it wasn't a 40-hour-a-week job, and at night I didn't want to continue working on the book. So I put it in a box, and then we moved back to Iowa 6 years ago, and eventually I pulled it out and did more research, did a couple more rewrites, and there it is.
So life happens.
It does,
but
yeah.
that inspiration, those talents, they're still within you, and you moved back, and it was time. It was time.
It was time,
to pull this out of the box and have it for a story for us all to read. So 3 little things.
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
What are they?
Yeah. So the main characters are Arno and Hattie, and though this is fiction, those were the names of my grandparents.
That was my next question. Okay, so those names are real.
They are.
Okay, this is unlike
the first names are real.
Unlike Dragnet, the names are real.
True,
The
yes.
story is where
right.
some of the creation
And is that your grandparents?
Those are my grandparents.
Oh, I love it.
Isn't that pretty? I love it too. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
But I started out telling their story, and then I realized my characters needed flaws, and I couldn't flaw my grandparents.
Ah, I
so
love that. Yes.
I pushed them
They're
aside.
too perfect.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
So Arno and Hattie are neighbors in the story, and he's leaving for boot camp. 10 locals are leaving for boot camp, and Hattie and her friends hand out a Bible verse in a sock that they've knitted. And so they give this to all the departing soldiers. And that sparks a conversation, and then they start exchanging letters. And in each letter, they tell each other 3 little things about themselves to get to know each other better, and they fall in love.
Nice.
I know.
So that's where it all came from.
Yeah.
With inspirations that we're taking from letters that your grandparents actually wrote to one another.
There's a letter in almost every chapter, and some of that follows exactly what the letter said in my grandparents' letters, and then it follows my grandpa's path. He starts out at Camp Dodge, and then he goes down to Camp Pike, and he moves over to New Jersey, and then he goes over to France.
Right. Now, what did those letters, when you were first looking at them, what were some of the feelings that you were getting while reading those?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I knew my grandfather, but we never talked about his war experience. But I'd never met my grandma. She passed away a couple months before I was born, so I got to know her in the letters. And, you know, a lot of things on the home front didn't change. She still went to dances. She lived on a farm. She had a lot of chores to do. Her mother had passed away when she was younger, so there's a lot about her family life and her siblings and her friends. And
were you able to connect by reading those letters with her?
I think so, yeah. She's very dear to me now.
You were kind of connecting with her as your grandfather was when they were trying to get to know one another way back in the way, which is just a beautiful thing. So talk about being a writer, obviously a passion of yours for many years. What would you say to others other Iowans out there that might have that passion, and maybe they as well had an idea but just kind of stored it away. What would you recommend to get things going again?
I think perseverance is the main thing. There are a million good writers out there, but they give up because writing is hard work.
Difficult, yeah.
It is. You get a lot of rejection. You just have to find that right fit, that right agent who believes in you, that right publisher who sees something special in your work. So don't give up. If you have that dream, no matter how old you are, just pursue it.
I love that.
Hopefully doors will open.
You're talking about having something special. You also received an endorsement.
I did.
Okay, explain
Crazy.
what this is all about.
Yeah, a lot of people know Debbie Maycomer. She is a New York Times bestseller. And I went to a conference last fall, and she was the keynote speaker. And so much of what she said, I can still remember it to this day. Well, on Sunday morning, we both found ourselves in an airport in Dallas. She was waiting to go to Seattle, I was waiting to fly back to Des Moines, and we struck up a conversation. We talked a lot of football, we talked, she was knitting, and I told her my grandma had tried to teach me to crochet and then told me to find a different hobby. That wasn't any good, yeah. And so we just kind of hit it off, and then she said, Patty, are you published? And I said, no, I'm not. And a minute later, she said, well, what do you write? And I said, well, I've written a letter inspired by letters my grandparents exchanged in World War I. And with her knitting needle still in her hand, she went like this and said, that touched my heart. So when it came time to find endorsers for my book, my editor said, write down a list of 10 writers that you know have met online or in person. And I made a list and sent out requests. And that's a crazy process because you're asking these busy writers to not only read your book, but then say nice things about it. And it's really hard. And then when I was done sending those out, I thought, well, the one writer I've probably talked to the most would be Debbie Maycomer. And so I found the nerve, sent her a message, and next thing you know, her assistant writes back and says, I think Debbie has time to write a blurb. And I thought, what's a blurb? So I Googled that, and it's just a shorter version of an endorsement. And then I sent a thank you note, and then Debbie sent me a congratulations card and a nice little note. And next thing I know, the assistant writes back and said, Debbie can do a full endorsement. So when can we get the book? And she just wrote the most beautiful endorsement. I still get teary-eyed when I read it. So, yeah.
Someone
so
that you admire is now admiring your work,
yeah,
which
she
is an incredible thing.
remembers what it was like to be a new author and looking for those endorsements and that support. So
That's special that she mentioned that it touched her just by hearing what it was about.
Yeah.
And sounds like she remembered that.
Well, I reminded her, but yeah, I think she remembered it.
There you go. So if people want to follow down a very beautiful path that was inspired by your family, how can they do so? How can we learn more about Three Little Things?
It's available for pre-sale now at Amazon. So just go to Amazon and type in my name or Three Little Things, and there's a button right there, and you can order it.
Okay,
I
pre-sale.
love it.
And when will it hit when people are going to be able to have it in their hands?
February 4th.
February
Okay,
4th.
so not too far away.
Okay.
Any
Exciting.
new inspirations, or we have another 20 years before we get a great
Any
book?
more letters and any more relatives give you more letters?
No more letters,
Okay.
but I've written a second book. It's called Because It's True, and I hope by the end of the month I'm able to send it to my agent, and then she can shop it around. So
I love it.
we'll see.
So we're going to see something even sooner
Yeah, I hope
of some new
so.
work.
Well,
Yeah,
let
I
us
hope
know the details on
Aw.
that and when it comes along too, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
I'll do that. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Well, thank you
I
so
love
much
it.
for being here.
All right, so
pleasure.
people want to learn more about you because obviously incredible things not only happening now but in the future. We encourage you to go check out your website as well.
Thank you so much.
Okay, there you go, PattiStockdale.com. Learn more about Three Little Things, especially by pre-ordering that book. That'll be out in February.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, she kept calling me Stockdale.
They spelled it right.
Did they?
Yeah. Website.
All right. So I'm pushing this arrow to go to the next screen. There we go. So everybody has a story, and this is the story behind the video we just watched. So I grew up in a very small rural community in Applington, Iowa. There are about 1,000 people there. And some of my earliest memories involve books. My parents were big readers, and my sisters and I grew up to be big readers, and I don't know any author who doesn't love to read. My mom was a school teacher, and then once, I don't know exactly, I think about the time my sister and I started school, she stayed at home and didn't teach anymore, but she would read to us from this really thick book of fairy tales, and there were no pictures, but I loved that book. And I don't know where it is to this day. I'd like to find it because I know she kept it. And I remember going to Story Hour. That was a really big deal. In this little community, Story Hour was always packed. And then when I got into elementary school, we would have weekly readers. And sometimes the weekly reader would just be like a little paper pamphlet, and it would tell us about what's going on in the world. We'd get Scholastic book orders. And even though we didn't have, you still get those now, don't you, Sawyer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Even though we didn't have a lot of money, our parents always let us get 1 or 2 books. And that's where I read Madeline and Clifford the Big Red Dog and later The World's Greatest Athlete. It was a real treat to get to have a library book. Not a library book, a book from the Scholastic Order. So this silly picture is 2 of my high school teachers. The one on the right is Mary Sullivan. She taught English, and she gave us an assignment one day when I was a junior that we needed to write a short story. So our short stories were supposed to be 5 to 6 pages. I forced myself to stop when my short story was about 28 to 30 pages. I don't remember much about it, except it was about a slumber party and how they didn't have cheese pizza. I think I got an A-, but I'm not positive. So my world tipped upside down a little bit when I was a senior. My dad died at 42. He had a heart attack one Saturday morning when my sister was watching cartoons. And I realized life is super short, and I didn't want to go to college. We didn't have a lot of money for college. I didn't know about scholarships and loans and grants, and my mom persuaded me to go to it's a community college now, but at that time it was a tech school. And I went to study to be a secretary. That was a 9-month class. And then 1 week after I graduated from secretarial school, I married my longtime boyfriend. And before, it wasn't too much later, we had Kelly, and then 3 years later, we had her brother. And we were living paycheck to paycheck for a while. And Steve was a meat cutter, and he ended up getting a job at a Hy-Vee. And we had to move to live in the community where the Hy-Vee was. And at this point, I had worked at a doctor's office, and then I got a job at a college. And I worked for the dean of the college. It was a community college. And after a while, he would say, "Patty, you need to go to college." I'm like, I can't work all day. I have 2 little kids and take classes at night. Maybe a year later, he said, "Patty, we will pay for Steve to go back to college." He'd gone for 1 year. So he went his sophomore year at that community college and then transferred to Iowa State and got a degree and became a statistician. So we moved to Des Moines area. And when I turned 35, then it was my turn to go to college. So my kids were a little bit older. I still work full-time. Now I'm a secretary at an accounting firm, which I really wanted to stop being a secretary at an accounting firm. So I went to college, 2 classes a semester. And it was wonderful. I was probably a much better student than I would have been right out of high school, but I was studying liberal arts and I loved it. And we get a notice that got to move on to the next screen here. We are moving again. This time we're moving to Pennsylvania. And we were outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I didn't like to drive all the way into the main campus to go to college, so I took classes at a satellite campus, and there weren't a lot of options. I still was working full-time, still had 2 kids at home, and I signed up for a World Civ class. It met 2 nights a week, and they canceled it, and the only other option was creative writing, and I was excited to take it, but I was afraid there was going to be too much homework. So I signed up, took the class, wrote my first short story, and I kept it 5-6 pages, like I was supposed to, turned it in, and I went to class the next week and walked in, and there was a portion of my short story on the chalkboard. Was that a good thing? It was a terrible thing. Our lesson was write what you know, and for some reason, I missed that, and I wrote about a snowstorm at the Denver, Colorado airport. I'm just thinking, as soon as there's a break, I'm getting up. I was sitting in the front row. I'm just going to pick up my stuff and quietly walk out and never come back. So the break arrived, and the guy sitting behind me, I still remember, his name was Dave Walters. He leaned forward and he said, "Man, I'm glad that's not mine." And I said, "I know what you mean. It wasn't a lie." But next thing you know, the break was done, and I'm still determined I'm going to drop this class. I get home and I say to Steve, he's watching a ball game, like, "I'm quitting." He's like, "Yeah, whatever you want." And found my kids and said, "You know what, I'm not going back there." And they're so like, "Fine, Mom." They didn't care at all. But something really funny happened to my son that week, and I thought that would make a really good short story. So I wrote it. I'm like, I'm going to prove to myself I can do this. Turned it in. When I get the paper back, on the bottom, the teacher wrote, "This shows so much promise. Talk to me after class." His name was Terry Wallace, and he became my mentor. And he invited me to a couple of creative writing classes, and he let me help at a writing conference that the school put on. It was had a lot of growth during that time period. And then we moved again, and this time to the Washington, D.C. area. We're in Northern Virginia, and there aren't a lot of community colleges there. But I knew about this writing school in Vermont. It was a distance learning program that was well known for their children's. There's masters in children's writing. That's not what it's called. I should know it, but I don't. But I thought, this is great. I'm going to try this. And so I did. And it was a really nice experience. I only needed to be on campus 2 weeks or 1 week a semester, so twice a year. And my employer worked with me on that. It was my senior year, and I needed a new project. And at the same time, my mom and her sister found this tin full of letters that their parents had written during World War I. And so I begged them to let me use those for the inspiration for my story. And at first they said no. They're very private, very conservative. They did not want me to have those letters. And finally I said, "You know what? Nobody's really going to see them. I'm never going to sell this book." But that's how the semester went. And some of the highlights were I had to read 25 books each semester focused on my project. And so I studied fiction and nonfiction, World War I, what the home front was like. I studied the Spanish flu. That was something that was a big part of my book because in real life, my grandma caught the Spanish flu and almost died. She ended up getting rheumatic fever. But because I had to speed up the timeline, I had to take that part of the story out. I read about how German Americans were persecuted. Does anybody else of German descent besides me and him? Somewhere, yeah. I embellished that in the story. I made it a bigger part of my story than what really happened to my grandpa. If people treated him unfairly because he was part German during the war, I'll never know because he didn't write about it. But they could no longer have German church services. They had to change the names of a wiener dog, had to be called a dachshund. You couldn't call a hot dog a wiener anymore. There was even a Babel proclamation that banned a lot of the things that German Americans were doing. So I learned a ton. I didn't like history when I was in high school, but I immersed myself in researching this book because I wanted it to be authentic. But I was intimidated because how was I going to tell anything about World War I? When I started this book, I couldn't have even told you what years the United States was involved with World War I. And I finally sent a message to my instructor and said, "I don't know that I can do this." And she said, "Hattie, you only have to tell the war through Arno's eyes, the hero, and the heroine's eyes, Hattie." And that gave me a lot of comfort and relief. So I graduated. I had written the first draft of the book that year, those 2 semesters. I graduated and then I needed a real job because I needed the money. And so we were living in Wisconsin at that time. And I took a job at the Colonial Club Senior Activity Center. It's a nonprofit. I was the programs director. And it wasn't a 9-to-5 job, so I didn't want to write. I did a fair share of writing at work, but not creative writing, so I shelved the book. And then we moved again. This time is when we moved to Iowa. And we lived there a couple years before I pulled the book out again and took a look at it, reread it, spent a long time researching it. We went to visit the World War I Museum in Kansas City, and we went to the first boot camp Grandpa was at Camp Dodge. And I called the second boot camp it was Camp Pike down in Arkansas. I wanted to know if they really did have 10 roofs on their barracks. I contacted Liverpool to find out which ship my grandpa used to cross the Atlantic. I wanted the book to be as true and authentic as it could be, but there was a fire and a lot of the documents involving World War I were destroyed. So I did the best that I could. I probably rewrote the book 10 times. The first version was in the first person, so it was told directly from the main character's viewpoint, and then I rewrote it in the third person. I made so many changes to it over time. One of the best things I ever did was to attend my first writing conference. You have an opportunity to pitch your book to agents and to pitch your book to editors. You're also able to network, you take classes and learn more. Even though I studied creative writing, I felt like I'd been removed from that environment for so long. There was so much I needed to learn. That was very valuable. That's where I met Debbie Maycomer. And how I finally sold the book was on Twitter. And I was not a big Twitter user, but they have what's called pitch parties where you can pitch your book to agents and editors. And the first time I did it, I had to try to sell my book in 140 characters. I didn't. Nobody was interested. The next time I did it, I had 11 people respond because it had given me like 4 months to work on this pitch. And one of the respondents was a big editor that I would love to have worked with. And she said, send me 3 chapters. So I did. And she said, no, it's not ready. You need to change this and this. Here's another idea. She was tremendously helpful. So I rewrote the book again. When that was done, maybe 9 months later, I didn't contact her because she didn't ask me to. But I ended up contacting one of the other editors who I knew through social media. And she said, yep, send me the full manuscript. And she bought it in 2 days. It's hard to sell a book if you don't have an agent. I hadn't been able to get an agent at that time. So working with this editor was like a master class. It was like my college classes times 10. I learned so much just with the hands-on experience. She warned me when you get your first edits back, you're going to see a lot of red ink. You're going to be blown away and frustrated. But she said, read through it, take a day or 2, and then go back. And a lot of her red marks were also questions. You know, she rose questions that I hadn't even thought about, which was extremely helpful. Her biggest complaint with my writing was that she didn't think I talked like a man in the dialogue. She's stereotypical, but she said men usually use shorter paragraphs, shorter sentences. So those were important things for me to learn. There were 3 rounds of proofreaders. One was just grammatical things. I can't remember what the second one was right now, but the third one was a historical proofreader. And after I had finished writing the book and I was ready to send it off, I sent the book to my son, who was a history major, and he caught a few things. But the 2 things I remember about this proofreader, he said there were not chocolate chip cookies in 1918, which I had no idea. Never looked it up because I never crossed my mind. And she said there weren't linking logs in the United States. I had researched that, but they were still in Europe at the time. I was very happy with the cover of the book. A lot of first-time authors are not happy because you lose a lot of control when you sell your book. But the publisher I worked with, they let me make suggestions for the cover, and they liked what we chose, and they went with it. And the cover artist, her name was Hannah Lindell, and she did an amazing job. when I started writing, I had no idea that I would have to promote my book as much as I do. I am the main marketer. It's not the publishing company. I know very few authors who like promoting themselves to the degree that we're expected to do that. So you form a street team. It goes by lots of different names. And these are people on social media who help promote it. And so that was huge for me to get the word out there. Working with my editor, her name was Peg, she connected me with her agent, whose name is Linda Blaze. And after a telephone conversation, she said, yep, I would like to work with you, Patty. And she sent my book to Publishers Weekly, and they gave me a favorable review, which I'm super grateful for. So the book came out February 2020. We had a launch party at I don't know what kind of store it was. There were some snafus involved with that, but we had the party and the family came and friends and we celebrated, and that was a milestone for me because I might never sell another book, so it was a big deal. Then I was in the library where I was living and getting some books, and then I noticed that they had this little tribute on the corner of the bookshelves that they were recognizing local authors. And I read a couple and I'm like, oh my gosh, I wonder if I'm on here. I found myself, so that was a big deal. And since I finished Three Little Things, so the book came out in February 2020, and I had lined up 20 to 25 speaking engagements to promote the book. I also contacted every library in the state of Iowa to ask them if they wanted the book. And I was invited to participate in the Des Moines Book Festival, but everything was canceled because of COVID, so it was a rough time to release a book, but that's okay. That's the way it goes. I've written 2.5 books. I've written another historical. I've done so much research on 1918, 1919 that my second book is also set during that time period. After I gave that to my agent, she said, hey, Patty, do you have any contemporaries? I'm like, no, but I'll write one. So I wrote a contemporary and sent that to her, and now I'm working on my second contemporary. And a lot of people always ask, where do you get your ideas? And you know where I got the idea for Three Little Things. For my second book, it's called Because It's True. I got that idea from watching the news. There was a story about a man who went to the cemetery to read to his deceased son every day. And it just touched my heart. And then I saw my sister-in-law and she said, did you see that story on the news the other night about the man who goes to the cemetery to read to his son? So that's how my second book opens. And that's a little more of a mystery than the first one. And the contemporary one is a romance, and the one I'm writing now is a contemporary romance too. So in September, Steve retired and we moved here and to be closer to our daughter and our grandsons. And it's a real treat to get to come to the library and come to the senior center, and we're happy to be here. That's the end of my story. I'd love to hear your questions if you have any. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sawyer, what's your question?
This is a compliment, not a question, but I really liked how it was organized, and I really liked, just, it was really interesting, the whole life story.
Aww. All right. Thanks, honey.
Yep.
Any other questions?
So when you write, you use a computer, or what is your writing process like?
Yeah.
You said you had written out some drafts. Like, do you do the whole thing and then go back and make edits, or do you kind of go with, like, I'm more interested in
Yeah,
how
that's a good question. I've done it both ways. When I write it on the computer, and then my first book, I would write and then I would go back and edit. And my strength is editing. I've taken 3 editing classes, and you need 4 to be a professional editor. Not because I want to be an editor, but I want to strengthen my own work. So I know that's where my strength and my power is. So I kept going back and reread what I'd written, and it was so laborious that that's why it took me 20 years to finish book. No, that's not why, but it was part of it. It just takes forever. And I keep taking more classes online and learning. And people have said, don't do that. You just sit down and get your story on paper and then go back. So my second, third, and fourth books, I did writing sprints. And it's called NaNoWriMo in November. It's National Write a Book Month. And I had read online where somebody said, you have documents for each chapter. Don't do it all together. And never go back and read until you're all the way done. Sometimes I would go back and read a scene just for continuity purposes. But that is a fabulous way to write a book, not the way I did the first time, where I kept editing as I went. So that would be one of my bigger pieces of advice for somebody who wants to write a book.
Straightforward.
Yep. Any other questions?
So you have an agent now?
I do, yep. I went to my first writing conference and I pitched 4 times and all 4 agents said, yep, send me either the full manuscript or the first 3 chapters. All of them, the ones I heard back from were like, no, you're not ready. And I wasn't ready. I'm even embarrassed that I tried to pitch that book. But at that point, I didn't know what I didn't know. In fact, I didn't consider my book a romance.
What did you think it was?
I guess I never labeled it. When we moved to Ankeny, I went to through the library. They had a creative writing group, so I went to it. It was me and 4 retired men, 3 were pastors. And the first time they read something that I'd written, we got back to the group and the man dropped my chapter on the table. He said, if I'd have known it was a romance, I'd have let my wife read it. And I got home and I was so offended. And Steve's like, yeah, it's a romance. It's a love story between your grandparents. I hadn't thought about it. What made my book difficult in the beginning is it's called episodic because it's a romance. You should have the main characters on the page together. But my grandpa goes off to war. So how was I going to keep them together to build on this romance? So he comes back. She goes to visit him when he's still at a boot camp. But it's the letters that tie them together. So there's enough romance to make it fall under that umbrella. Anything
Did
else?
you say that you're writing another book?
I am. Yep. I've written 2 more, and my agent has been shopping them around. I don't know if she'll ever sell them. My first book was with what's considered a smaller press, and she's trying to sell them to bigger presses so she can get royalties. And I did not make much money selling this book. I don't know how many books I've sold, but it's not a money maker. At least at this point in my career, it's an investment in my writing. And if I never sell another book, I can live with that, but I'd sure like to. I'm not about to self-publish. That does not have the negative connotation like it used to anymore, because people do very well self-publishing and it's respected. I just don't want to jump through all these hoops at that point. I'm tired of all the self-promotion. So we'll see. If I don't hear from my agent the beginning of February, I'll contact her. It's really intimidating because that's her job. She's the one who's trying to sell it. She knows better than I do. But it's also, I feel like I'm spinning my wheels a little bit.
Now, which is the one about the man that's by the grave?
Yep, that one's called Because It's True. She's
Is that
trying
your
to sell
second or
that.
third one?
That's the second one, and
Okay.
we had, I can't think of the publisher. It was not an inspirational publisher. It was Kensington, or it was one of the big publishers that bid and asked for the full manuscript and read it and then like, nope, not gonna buy it. But those little pieces of encouragement are helpful, you know, because you can have a lot of self-doubt when you're a writer. It's just the way it works. It's part of the package. So you have to have a thick enough skin because of all the rejections that are going on out there. I've kind of lost track who has it now and who doesn't have it.
You kind of sit down and kind of fictionalize, if you want to call it, what you're going to write. If you have already set idea of what, if it's going to be a mixture of romance or whatever.
Yep, I typically outline a book. There's a lot of great how to write courses and classes, and you'd be surprised. I don't want to call all romances a formula, but there are certain benchmarks that you have to hit with your story. I'm taking a class right now, Jamie Jo Wright. I bet you know who she is. No,
I don't.
she's a Wisconsin author.
Oh,
Yeah.
I've heard of her, but I don't know what she is.
Yeah, you would like her, I bet. Oh, she's
Yeah,
a little
I-
scary, but
I've heard
she's
of her,
not
but-
scary. Her books are scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm taking her class right now. Hopefully, she doesn't see this video. But she taught last night. So I build the characters. Lots of times I've been told I'm a character-driven author versus a plot-driven author. I don't like plot. I like what happens to the character develops the plot, but I have to have kind of an idea when I set out to write. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I plot it out a little bit. They call people pantsers or plotzers. Plotters, they're going to have outlines and really follow this method. And pantsers, they fly by the seat of their pants. And I think I'm a hybrid. So I don't know what I'm going to write about next. I have little ideas. There's something called Hello Girls during World War I. Have you guys heard of that at all? They were the women that went overseas and ran they were telephone operators. I think that would be pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you got any great ideas, let me know. It's hard for me to come up with, selling ideas.
I gotta share this, Mom, because
Okay.
I think it's cute that, so when she starts writing a book and she's got her ideas for characters, she finds pictures online or like in magazines or things and cuts them out. So you'll go in her office and she'll have this board up with like pictures of strangers on it. And the first time she's like, who are all these people?
That sounds like that you're using Storyboard to help you along.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
a storyboard. Yep, same idea. That way I remember what color their hair is or their eyes, and I don't want two people to look too much alike. It just helps me think that through. And once I develop the characters and the plot a little bit, then I have to think a little bit about the scene. I want it to seem like I like talking about the scene. If you're at a farm, what does that look like? That's a fun part of the process for me. A lot of authors want to have a theme to their story. That's not a big, important point for me, but that's big for a lot of authors. You sound like you know a lot about books.
Well, I like reading it, but I like Tom Clancy and that
Oh,
kind
sure.
of stuff, because the way him and Clive Cussler, they write their books in such a way you feel like you're right there.
Yeah.
That I like, when you can immerse yourself
Yeah.
right into the situation, and they talk more or less like you would talk back and forth if you're doing something with somebody. And I enjoy that.
Yeah.
But I'm technically a scientist, so I like to read about science and all.
Oh, sure. A lot of that is called deep POV, point of view. So if an author is really good at writing deep point of view, like she or he can put themselves in the mind and the body of that character, you feel it. It makes a difference when an author really has tackled that. Steve reads Clive Cussler too, so good author. Any other questions? The book is for sale. It's $15, but you don't need to buy it. It's also, you can read it for free at the library.
I bought it on Amazon.
You
so if
did?
there's anything, it'll be canceled.
Oh, that was so kind of you. Well, let me know if you have any questions. I got a bookmark for you.
But I thought, sure as anything, it'll be canceled if I don't get it now.
Oh, well, you made my whole night. That's
So it
really
came Monday. Thank you.
thoughtful of you. Thank you so much.